The cold came up through the floorboards before anything else did. That was the first wrong thing. And I've learned since that the first wrong thing is always the one you should listen to hardest, because it's the one that hasn't yet learned to disguise itself. It was August. The kind of August that sits on a man's shoulders like a wet coat, where the air outside the farmhouse shimmered over the dead fields and the cicadas screamed in the tree line from morning to dark. The thermometer nailed to the porch post had read 94 when we'd come in for lunch, and the inside of that old house held the heat the way old houses do, baking it into the plaster and the dark wood until you felt you were breathing through cloth. There was no air conditioning. There hadn't been a working system in that house since before my grandmother died. We'd been sweating through our shirts for 3 days. So when I felt cold air on my ankles in the back pantry, my body knew something was wrong before my mind caught up. I remember stopping mid-step with the crowbar in my hands, the iron of it slick with my own sweat, and feeling the hair on my arms lift. Cold. Real cold. The kind that rolls low along the floor and pools around your feet. The farmhouse had no basement we knew about, no cellar, nothing on the deed my grandfather left us. But standing in that back pantry, I could feel a draft of refrigerated air pushing up between the planks, the kind of cold that doesn't come from dirt. Dirt holds the day's heat. A root cellar in August is cool, maybe, damp and earthy, but it isn't cold. This was machine cold. This was the cold of a place that had been sealed and kept at temperature for a long, long time. And the smell that came up with it wasn't the smell of earth or mildew. It was clean, sterile, the smell of a walk-in freezer in an empty restaurant, the smell of something kept. My brother Dale knelt down and brushed away 70 years of dust with the flat of his hand, and there it was. A trapdoor. Steel, not wood. Painted to look like wood, with a fake grain pressed into the metal. A clever, deliberate forgery that someone had taken real trouble over. There was a recessed ring handle that some careful hand had set flush so that a man could walk over it for a lifetime and never know. I ran my thumb along the seam where the steel met the floorboards and felt how tight it sat, how precisely it had been fitted. This was not farm work. Farmers build things to function, not to hide. There was a keyhole, modern and clean. And there was a small brass plate, tarnished almost black with age. And when I rubbed it with my thumb, the corrosion came away in a gray smear, and I could read 4 stamped words. Property of the state. Dale sat back on his heels and looked up at me. He had our father's face, broad and open, and right then it was working through something it couldn't make fit. Grandpa was a corn farmer, he said slowly. Russ, why does a corn farmer have a state trapdoor humming cold air in his pantry? I didn't have an answer. I crouched there with the crowbar across my knees and the cold air moving against my shins, and I listened. And under the silence of that dead house, I could hear it now that I was paying attention. A low hum, steady, the kind of sound your ears edit out until the moment you notice it, and then you can't stop hearing it. Machinery, running. Underneath my grandfather's pantry, something had power, and something was cold, and something had been waiting. I wish to God I'd told him to leave it alone. I wish I'd taken that crowbar and driven the trapdoor's edges back down and nailed the linoleum over it and walked out into the heat and never come back. But I'm a man who fixes things, and a problem you can hear is a problem you cannot leave alone. I want to take 10 seconds before this goes any further. Thank you to everyone who keeps coming back to these stories. And if this is your first night here, welcome. Pull the doors shut behind you. If this kind of slow, grounded survival horror is your thing, subscribe and leave a comment, because it genuinely keeps this channel alive. Now let me tell you exactly what we found under that floor, and why I haven't slept right since. My name is Russell Crane. I'm 51 years old, and for most of my working life, I was a field service technician for a company that maintained backup power systems, generators, automatic transfer switches, battery banks, fuel cell arrays for the places that can't afford to ever go dark. Hospitals where a power flicker means a man on a table doesn't wake up. Water treatment plants, telecom hubs, data centers where a single second of downtime costs more than I make in a year. I spent 30 years walking into mechanical rooms in the middle of the night with a flashlight in my teeth and a meter in my hand, finding the one failing component in a system designed never to fail. That matters to this story. And I'm not telling you to brag. I'm telling you because it's the reason I understood what I was looking at, when most men would have just seen concrete and shadow. It's also the reason I didn't run when running was still an option. A man who understands a system believes he can master it. That belief is the most dangerous thing I own. Dale was 3 years younger than me, 48 that summer, and he worked construction, concrete, framing, demolition, the heavy end of the trade. That made him useful with a crowbar and useless at patience. Dale was the kind of man who, if you told him not to touch the wet paint, would touch the wet paint to see how wet it was. We'd been close as boys and then drifted the way brothers do when life pulls in different directions. And the death of our grandfather had thrown us back together in a way neither of us had asked for. That's why we were there. Our grandfather, Walter Crane, had finally died at 94, in a hospital bed 2 counties over, lucid almost to the end, and saying nothing that made any sense in the last week of it. The property fell to the 2 of us because our father had died years before and there was no one else. Nobody had lived in the house since our grandmother passed a decade back. Grandpa had moved into an assisted place in town and let the farm go quiet. The fields had gone to weed and scrub. The barn had half collapsed under a winter's snow load, and the house had settled into the particular silence of a place that remembers being lived in. We figured we'd spend a week clearing it out, fix what we could, salvage what was worth salvaging, and put the land on the market. 2 middle-aged men, a rented dumpster sitting in the side yard, and a tall stack of flattened cardboard boxes we'd bought at a moving store. That was the plan. That was supposed to be the entire story. A week of dusty, sweaty, sad work, sorting through a dead man's life, and then a sign by the county road, and a check split 2 ways. We'd been at it 3 days, when Dale's boot found the soft spot in the pantry floor. It was late afternoon. We'd cleared the pantry shelves of decades of mason jars and rusted cans and a mummified bag of flour, and Dale was sweeping when the boards flexed under his weight. A hollow give that stopped him cold. He stamped on it, testing. "Rot," he said. "Feel that? Joist's gone soft right here." I came over and stamped on it too, and it gave, but it didn't give the way rot gives. Rot is spongy. This was a clean, sprung flex, like a board with no support under it. We pulled up the old linoleum to assess the joists, peeling it back in cracked yellow sheets that crumbled in our hands, and threw up a cloud of dust that hung in the slanting light from the one small window. Underneath the linoleum was a layer of plywood that didn't match anything else in the house newer. A different grade, screwed down rather than nailed. And under the plywood was the steel. You have to understand the feeling of finding something deliberately hidden in a place you thought you knew. It rearranges you from the inside. It makes the floor under your own feet feel untrustworthy. This house held my whole childhood. I'd eaten cereal at the kitchen table 20 feet from that trapdoor every summer of my youth. I'd hidden in this very pantry during games of hide and seek pressed into the corner with my heart pounding. While my grandfather counted to 10 in the kitchen, he had stood in this pantry 1,000 times, reaching past the spot where his grandson crouched to take down a jar of his wife's preserves, knowing what was beneath his feet. And he never said a word. Not to my father, who died never knowing. Not to my grandmother, maybe. Not to us. He had carried it alone, for the better part of his life. A secret so heavy, it had bent the whole shape of him. And we'd never seen the weight of it, because he'd never let us. The keyhole was the strange part. The brass plate was tarnished black with decades of neglect. The steel had a fine bloom of surface rust at the edges. But the lock mechanism itself, when I got my face down close and shone my phone light into it, was clean, oiled. The brass of the cylinder gleamed. Someone had maintained it. Someone had knelt here, in this pantry, recently enough to matter, and worked oil into that lock and wiped it down and set everything back in place, the linoleum, the dust, the silence. And the cold air kept pushing up, steady and patient, which meant something down there still had power. 3 days in a dead house with no electricity to the meter, the main breaker thrown and the power company long since disconnected, and something underneath was running on its own, running without us. "We need a key," Dale said. He was already looking around the pantry as if one might be hanging on a nail. "We need to call somebody," I said. "That plate says state property. That's not ours to open. There's a process for this. We find out who built it, and we let them deal with it." But even as I said it, I was already thinking about who you'd call, and finding nothing. The county. The county owns roads, and a courthouse, and a landfill. The state owns 10,000 things, and tracks none of them properly. Agencies get reorganized, records get boxed and lost in basements. The men who knew things retire and die. There was a part of me, the same part that takes a failed panel apart on the shop bench just to see how it died, even when I've already replaced it, that could not abide the idea of walking away from this without an answer. The cold air was a problem with a cause, and I have never in my life been able to leave a problem with a cause alone. It's a flaw in me. My wife used to say I'd rather understand a thing than survive it. She wasn't entirely wrong. Dale found the key that night, and that's the part I keep coming back to, because it tells you this was never meant to stay buried forever. We'd given up on the pantry for the day and moved into the front room, working by the light of 2 battery lanterns we'd set on the mantel, because the sun was down and the house had no power. And the dark in that place was absolute, the kind of country dark that has weight to it. Dale was going through Grandpa's old roll-top desk, the heavy oak one with the warped drawers that had always smelled of pipe tobacco and ink. He was pulling drawers all the way out to dump them, the way he did everything, fast and rough. And when he yanked the center drawer free, he turned it over to empty it and stopped. Taped to the underside of the drawer, in brittle yellow tape that had gone the color of old honey, was a key and a folded square of paper. The key was modern, stainless steel, freshly cut, the kind you'd get made at a hardware store last year, not last century. It did not belong in that desk. It did not belong in that house. The paper was creased soft from handling, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. Dale peeled it free and unfolded it under the lantern light. And I came around the desk to read over his shoulder, and there was a single line in our grandfather's cramped, careful hand. The same hand I'd seen on the inside of every birthday card I'd gotten until I was 30. It said, "If the cold ever stops, do not open it. If the cold is still running, you may have time to close it again." Neither of us understood that sentence, We read it out loud, both of us, turning it over like a riddle scratched on a cell wall. Time to close it again before what? The cold was running. We'd felt it. By the plain logic of the note, that meant the situation was, in some sense, still all right, still under control. That's how Dale read it anyway. He read permission into a warning. People do that. I've done it. You see the half of the sentence that lets you do the thing you already wanted to do, and you let the other half go soft and quiet in your mind. I should have read it the other way. I've had a year to read it the other way, and now it's the only way I can read it. A man does not leave instructions for closing something unless he expects, with cold certainty, that the day will come when someone opens it. He had cut a modern key and hidden it where only family clearing the house would ever find it. He had not given it to a lawyer, not sealed it in a safe deposit box with a letter for the authorities, not handed it to anyone official. He had hidden it for blood, blood that wouldn't go running to the state, blood that would feel the pull of obligation and family duty and shame, and that would deal with whatever was down there quietly, the way he had, the way his predecessors had. He had been recruiting us from beyond the grave, and we didn't even know there was a war. We didn't sleep much that night. We'd brought sleeping bags and were camping in the old front bedrooms, and I lay on the bare mattress listening to the house tick and settle and to Dale tossing in the next room. And under all of it, faint through the floor, that low, steady hum. Around 5 a.m, with the first gray light beginning to gray the bedroom curtains, I gave up on sleep and went out to the kitchen for water, and I found Dale already there. He was sitting on the floor of the pantry, the key in his hand, his ear bent close to the seam of the trapdoor. "Russ," he said, and he didn't look up. "Come listen to this." I crouched down beside him on the cold boards. Under the hiss of the chilled air rising through the seam, there was another sound. I had to hold my breath to hear it. Faint, rhythmic, mechanical. A cycling. The unmistakable thrum and release of a compressor kicking on. Running its cycle and shutting off. The way a walk-in freezer breathes in a quiet kitchen at night. I knew that sound the way a sailor knows the sea. I'd spent 30 years listening to machines tell me how they felt. And this one sounded tired. The cycle was long. It was working hard. And under that, almost too quiet to be sure of, layered beneath the compressor, there was a third sound, a low electronic tone, repeating, patient. The kind of tone a system makes when it has been trying to tell someone something for a very long time and no one has come to listen. An alarm that has given up on being urgent and settled into something almost like prayer. I put the key in the lock before my better judgment could stop my hands. I want to be honest that there was no long deliberation in that moment. My hand reached out and my fingers found the keyhole, and the key slid home and turned. And it turned smoothly. No grit, no resistance. Like a key turned 100 times. And the bolt drew back with a soft, well-machined snick. The ring handle, when I hooked my fingers under it and lifted, came up heavier than any wood door has a right to be solid steel. Weighted, my shoulders straining, and the trapdoor swung up on a hinge that had been greased so recently I could smell the petroleum of it over the cold, sterile air. Below us was not a root cellar. Below us was a steel ladder going straight down into a concrete shaft. The walls poured smooth and gray, and at the bottom there was a dull red glow, the unmistakable red of a low-wattage emergency lamp. The cold poured up out of that shaft like water out of a broken dam, rolling over the lip of the trapdoor and spilling across the pantry floor. And my breath fogged in front of my face for the first time in that 90-degree August dawn. Somewhere down in that red light, The electronic tone kept repeating. And now that the door was open, I could hear it clearly. And it was not a tone at all. It was a voice. A recorded human voice, looping, calm and dead and decades old, rising up out of the cold and the red, saying the same short sentence over and over into the dark beneath my grandfather's house. We stood there a long time before either of us went down. I want to be honest about that, because in the stories people tell afterward, they always make the choice sound fast and brave. Men of action striding into the dark. It wasn't like that. We stood at the lip of that shaft, with the cold pooling around our ankles and our breath smoking in the dawn. And we argued in low voices, the way you do when part of you is afraid of being overheard by something you can't see. Dale's whisper. My whisper. Two grown men whispering over a hole in the floor like boys afraid of waking a parent. Dale wanted to go down. Dale always wanted to go down. He had that energy in him, the demolition man's certainty that the way to understand a thing is to get into it and start pulling it apart. The voice was the thing that pushed me over the edge, and I want you to understand the specific shape of the reasoning. Because it's the reasoning of a competent man, and competent men die of it all the time. A looping recording means a system designed to be heard. A system designed to be heard means information. And information was the only thing on God's earth that was going to make sense of the cold and the key and the note. And my grandfather's 70 years of silence. I didn't go down because I was brave. I went down because I needed to know. And I had spent my whole life believing that knowing keeps you alive. That belief was about to be tested all the way to the bottom of it. The latter was the first concrete fact that told me what I was actually dealing with. I went first, and I went carefully, testing each rung with my weight before I trusted it. Galvanized steel, set into the poured concrete of the shaft on heavy brackets, the kind of installation that costs real money and requires a crew and equipment you cannot sneak onto a property without people noticing. Concrete trucks, a generator, a survey crew, which meant whatever this was had been built openly, by people with authority and budget, almost certainly before my grandfather ever owned the land. The farmhouse had been built on top of it or around it, the pantry placed to hide the access. The corn was camouflage. The whole farm, I was beginning to understand, was camouflage, a green and waving disguise laid over something the people who made it had wanted very badly to forget. I counted the rungs going down, because counting gives your hands and your mind something to hold when the fear is rising. 22 rungs. The cold deepened with each one, and the red light grew, and the looping voice grew clearer. At the bottom was a small landing, perhaps 4 feet by 6, poured concrete with a drain grate set in the center of the floor, and a steel door. The heavy kind. A wheel handle at its center like the hatch on a ship, a thick rubber gasket seal running around its frame, and the red light leaking around its edges in thin, bright lines. Beside the door, mounted on the concrete wall at head height, was a speaker grill, the old perforated metal kind. And out of that grill came the looping voice. And now, standing right beneath it in the cold, I could understand every word. Containment is stable. Do not open the inner door. Containment is stable. Do not open the inner door. It repeated every 11 seconds. I timed it against the second hand in my head, because there's a comfort in timing things, a way of pretending that a thing you can measure is a thing you can control. 11 seconds. Containment is stable. Do not open the inner door. Over and over, into the dark, for what I would later understand was the better part of a human lifetime. Dale came down the ladder behind me, his boots ringing on the rungs, and he stepped onto the landing, and stood with his back pressed to the concrete and read the words off a stenciled sign bolted to the wall beside the wheel door. The paint had aged to the color of old teeth, yellowed and flaking, but the letters were still legible under his phone light. United States Public Health Service, Field Isolation Station 7, authorized personnel only. Field Isolation Station, Dale read, and his voice had gone quiet and careful, the energy draining out of it. Russ, this is a quarantine bunker. This is a government quarantine bunker under Grandpa's house. I knew about these. Not this one specifically, but the category. I'd read about them. The way a man in the power trade reads about Cold War infrastructure, because that era left buried things all over this country, and some of them still have wiring you might be asked to look at. During the early Cold War, and even before, the government built small isolation facilities in remote rural areas. Some were for studying things. Some were for holding things. Some, the ugly ones nobody put in the brochures, were for holding people. They scattered them across farm country precisely because farm country is empty and quiet and the population density is low, and nobody asks the man with the corn what's under his corn. Most were decommissioned and forgotten when the program that built them ended or the agency that ran them was folded into another. The records got lost in reorganizations, scattered across file rooms, classified and then forgotten as classified, which is its own kind of erasure. The land got sold off as surplus or quietly transferred. And the families who bought that land sometimes inherited a sealed door and a directive and a silence, and they kept it for reasons that made sense to them. Reasons of fear and duty, and a paycheck that arrived every month, so long as the cold kept running. The cold made sense to me now, too. And that was almost worse, because understanding it took away the last comfort of thinking it might be nothing. A facility built to hold biological material would have refrigeration to keep samples viable, or to keep something dormant. The compressor I'd heard breathing under the pantry was the cooling plant, and it was still running after all these years, which meant it still had power, which meant somewhere in this concrete tomb there was a power source that had been quietly burning for decades. And that should have been impossible. Diesel runs dry, batteries die, even the good ones, in a few years. The grid feed would have been cut when the place was abandoned, and besides, the house above had no power. So what was running the cold? I found the answer on the landing wall, behind a small, hinged steel cover I almost missed. I worked the cover open on its stiff hinge, and behind it was a meter. An old analog meter with a needle and a glass face gone slightly cloudy with age, and a hand-lettered label above it on a strip of yellowed tape, and the label said RTG output, and the needle was sitting in the green band of the dial. I felt the blood go out of my face. I felt it physically, a cold, draining sensation that had nothing to do with the air. Dale saw it happen. "What?" he said. "Russ, what is it? What's RTG?" "Radioisotope thermoelectric generator," I said, and I worked to keep my voice flat and even, because a flat, even voice was the only thing keeping me steady. "It's a nuclear battery. No moving parts. You take a slug of radioactive material, plutonium usually, and the heat of its decay runs a thermocouple, and you get electricity, not much, but you get it for decades, with nothing to refuel, nothing to maintain. They put them in places where you couldn't get back to service them. Remote lighthouses, weather stations in the Arctic, satellites that have to run for 50 years past the last man who touched them." I looked at the needle, sitting there in the green. It's been powering the cold this whole time, quietly, for decades, and it'll keep powering it for a while yet, until the isotope decays past the point where it makes enough heat to matter. I heard my own voice slow down as the pieces locked together. That's why the note said if the cold ever stops. The cold stopping means the battery finally died. And if the battery dies, the cold dies and whatever they kept cold down here, Dale finished for me, very quietly, wakes up. We should have climbed back out right then. I want that on the record, clear and plain, for whatever it's worth. The note had told us we still had time to close it. The voice was telling us every 11 seconds that containment was stable and the inner door should not be opened. The meter was green. Every single signal in that shaft was screaming the same instruction. And the instruction was simple and complete. Leave, close the trapdoor, walk away, and never come back. There was no ambiguity in it. There was nothing left to figure out. But I made the mistake that I think most competent people make. The mistake that competence itself sets you up for. I trusted my competence. I told myself that I understood the situation now, and that understanding it made me safe. That a man who knows what an RTG is, who can read a compressor's cycle by ear, who has stood in 100 failing mechanical rooms and walked out alive, is not the same as a frightened man stumbling blind into a hole in the ground. I told myself I'd just look, just confirm. Just gather enough hard information to know who to call and what to tell them. So that when I made the call, I'd be believed instead of dismissed as a crank who found something strange under a farmhouse. So I reached out, and I set both hands on the cold, wet steel of the wheel, and I spun it. It didn't open onto the thing I was afraid of. That's the part that makes my hands shake even now, telling it all and these months later. It opened onto an airlock. A small steel chamber, maybe 6 feet square. The same poured concrete and steel, lit by a single red bulb inside a wire cage screwed to the ceiling. There was another wheeled door on the far side, identical to the first. The cold in here was deeper, a still, dense cold that pressed on my eardrums. And on the right-hand wall of the airlock was a rack of equipment. And the equipment was the second moment that told me everything had changed. That this was not a relic, but a system that had been built by people who expected, with grim precision, that someone would one day stand exactly where I was standing. Yellow rubber suits, hooded hanging on pegs, with full face masks and corrugated air hoses that ran to fittings on the wall. Boxes of filter cartridges, sealed in plastic that had gone brittle and amber with age, stacked neatly. A first aid station with its red cross faded to pink. And mounted on the wall by the inner door, hanging from a steel chain bolted to the concrete, was a clipboard, a logbook. And that logbook ended up mattering more than anything else in that whole bunker, more than the suits or the meter or the wheeled doors, because it was the only thing down there that could talk. I lifted the clipboard off its hook. The chain rattled. Dale crowded in behind me, his shoulder against mine, both of us breathing the cold, dense air and watching it fog. And as he pressed in, the outer wheeled door we'd come through swung half shut behind us on its hinge, with a long, low groan of metal that made us both go rigid. We turned together to look at it. It hadn't latched. It just hung there, half closed. But the sound of it had done something to my heart rate that took a while to settle. The looping voice was muffled now, coming through the steel from the landing. Containment is stable. Do not open the inner door. The logbook entries were in different hands across the years. Official and clipped at the start, then fewer, then sparse. The way the handwriting in any abandoned record thins out as the institution behind it loses interest and dies. The earliest dates were from the early 1950s. Routine, sample integrity verifications, cooling plant pressure and temperature readings, personnel rotation sign-offs. radiation badge swaps, page after page after page of bureaucratic tedium. Men in a buried concrete room, signing their names to confirm that the cold was cold, and the seals were sealed, and the needle was in the green. I turned the pages and watched a decade of men doing their dull, careful jobs. Then the entries thinned. The 1960s had maybe 10 pages, the readings less frequent, the handwriting more careless. The 1970s had 2 pages. The second one, just a single line confirming a maintenance visit. And then there was a gap, a long blank space of yellowed paper. And the next entry, when it came, was in handwriting I knew better than I knew my own, because I'd seen it on birthday cards and Christmas tags and tax envelopes, and the night before, on a folded square of paper taped under a desk drawer, my grandfather's handwriting. The first entry from him was dated the year he bought the farm, the year I was a boy of 6. I read it twice, and then a third time, in the cold red light with Dale's breath on my neck. It said, "Took over site responsibility per arrangement with Dr. Vance. Pension paid quarterly in exchange for monitoring cooling plant and maintaining cold. Instructed, never open inner door under any circumstance. Have read prior log. God forgive them for what they have put in here, and forgive me for keeping it. W. Crane." A pension. That was the thing that landed first and hardest. My grandfather had not stumbled onto this. He had been hired, recruited the same as us, except they'd done it while he was alive and paid him for it. Some Dr. Vance, some last official of a dying program, had found a quiet farmer willing to buy a piece of land with a secret under it and keep the secret cold in exchange for a check, because the program could no longer afford to staff the place and could not bring itself to do whatever the alternative was. My whole childhood, the trips out to this farm, the corn, the quiet dinners, my grandfather's particular stillness that we'd all read as the natural reticence of a countryman, all of it had been lived on top of this. Every check that put food on his table and clothes on my father's back had been payment for keeping the cold running over whatever lay behind that inner door. I looked at that inner wheel door now, the one on the far side of the airlock, and at the second stenciled warning bolted beside it. The outer door's sign had said authorized personnel only, dry bureaucratic boilerplate. This one was different. This one said biological isolation, do not breach. And here was the detail that put a finger of ice straight up my spine. The paint on this sign was newer than anything else in the bunker. Fresher. Someone had repainted these words carefully by hand. The white still bright against the steel, as if they had come down here over the years with a brush and a small can of enamel and traced over the letters to keep them legible, so that no future person would ever, even in dim red light with shaking hands, be able to claim they hadn't understood. My grandfather. He had come down here with a paintbrush for decades, keeping the warning fresh and bright and unmissable for a grandson he had not yet met, for the night he somehow knew would come. I'm going to stop the story here for just a moment, because I've thought about this part more than any other. In the long, sleepless stretches of the months since, picture us, 2 brothers in their 50s and late 40s, standing in a 6-foot concrete airlock under a dead man's pantry, in cold that fogs every breath, in red light, holding a logbook on a chain that begged us not to open the inner door. All of it powered by a nuclear battery that had outlived every man who installed it. If you were down in that red light with us, knowing only what we knew right then, would you have kept reading that logbook, turning toward the worst of it? Or would you have put the clipboard back on its hook and climbed the 22 rungs back to the daylight? I'd genuinely like to know where you'd have drawn the line, because I drew mine in the wrong place. and I've never been able to move it back. Let me tell you what we found on the last page. The last entry in the logbook was not in the steady hand of my grandfather's prime. It was in a shakier version of it, the cramped, careful letters loosened and trembling. The writing of a very old man, whose hand no longer obeyed him fully. And it was dated only 8 months before he died. 8 months. Which meant that at 93 years old, frail enough that he needed help to stand from a chair in the assisted living place in town, he had somehow gotten himself out to this farm, and down a ladder of 22 steel rungs into the cold and the red, alone, to make one final entry. The thought of it, an old man, lowering himself rung by rung into that shaft, knowing what waited behind the inner door, to write a last warning to whoever came after it, undid something in me, standing there. It still does. The entry said, "Cooling plant cycling longer each month. RTG output dropping below half. It will not outlast me by long, and I will not outlast this winter. To whoever finds this, they lied about what is in here. It is not a sample in a jar. Before you decide anything, look through the inner observation port and understand what you are dealing with. But do not, under any circumstance, open the inner door. The cold is the only thing that has ever held it, and the cold is failing." W. Crane. Dale was reading over my shoulder. His breath stopped. "Observation port," he said softly. "Russ, he's telling us to look. He's saying look through the port." "He's telling us to look so that we'll understand why, never to open it," I said. "Read it again. That's different. He's not inviting us in. He's showing us the consequences so we'll have the spine to walk away." But the word port had already done its work on both of us, the way I think Grandpa, in his terrible wisdom, must have known it would. There is a difference, deep in the wiring of the human animal, between an unknown danger and a danger you can see. The mind cannot leave an unknown alone. It fills the dark behind the door with everything, every horror it can build. And the not knowing becomes its own unbearable pressure. A port, a window, promised to replace that infinite dark with one finite bounded fact. And I told myself again, the same lie that had carried me down 22 rungs and through one wheeled door and into an airlock built to contain the worst thing the government could imagine. That looking was not the same as opening. That information was safety. That a single glance through a sealed pane of glass committed me to nothing at all. The observation port was set into the inner door at eye level. A small, thick circle of glass, maybe 4 inches across, the kind of laminated heavy glass you'd find in a furnace door. And it was frosted opaque with cold on its inner face. Over it, on our side, was a sliding steel cover, and stenciled beneath the cover, in that same freshly painted white, were 2 words, "Observation only." I reached up. My hand was not steady, and I made no pretense to myself that it was. I slid the steel cover back. It moved on a greased track with a soft scrape. Dale pressed his shoulder against mine so we could both get our faces to the small circle of glass at once. 2 grown men cheek to cheek in the cold. And I wiped the condensation off the outer surface with the cuff of my sleeve, and the glass cleared, and I looked into the inner chamber of Field Isolation Station 7. I'll tell you exactly what I expected, so you'll understand the shape of what I felt when I was wrong. I expected a steel canister on a rack, a sample case, maybe a small frozen specimen in a stainless tray, some petri dish horror sealed in glass, a thing that had needed cold storage and a concrete tomb and a nuclear battery to keep it dead. Something small, something institutional and impersonal, something you could look at and think, all this for that? What I saw was a room. A small concrete room, 10 feet by 10 feet, lit by the same dull red bulb in its wire cage. Frost lay over every surface, white and feathered. On the walls, the floor, the single steel gurney bolted to the concrete in the center. And on that gurney, under a sheet that had frozen solid and fused to the shape beneath it, molded to it like a death mask of cloth, was a human body. Not a specimen, not a canister, a man. The frozen sheet had pulled tight over the contours of a face, and the face was turned toward the door, toward the port, toward us. And even through the frost on the glass and the dim red light, I could see that the eyes were open, frozen open, I told myself. Just frozen open. The way eyes can be, the way a thing left in the cold sets in whatever position the cold found it. The eyes were turned toward the door, the way you would turn your eyes toward a door if you had been put in a cold room and left there, and were waiting, with a patience that had no bottom to it, for the door to finally open. And then the eyes moved. I have spent every one of the months since trying to convince myself that I imagined it. I'm a rational man. I've built each explanation carefully, the way I'd troubleshoot a fault, ruling things out one at a time. A trick of the frost shifting on the glass as it melted under the warmth of my sleeve. A reflection of my own moving eye thrown back at me by the curved pane. The mind inventing motion in stillness because the mind, under that kind of terror, will invent anything to make sense of what it cannot bear. I have run through every one of these explanations in the dark, turned each one over, polished it, tried to make it hold. Not one of them holds, because the eyes did not glint or flicker. They tracked. They moved, slowly, from the center of the glass to the place where my face was pressed against it. The slow, deliberate movement of a thing that is very cold and very old, and has not had anything new to look at in a very long time. And then they stopped, fixed on me, found me in the dark, through the glass, and the frozen sheet over the chest of that body. The sheet that had fused solid to the shape beneath it rose, just slightly, the unmistakable swell of a chest taking a slow breath, a breath it did not need, in a body that should not have had one to give, but had not, in all those frozen decades, forgotten how to take. Dale made a sound I had never heard him make in 48 years of knowing him. A high broken sound torn out of the bottom of his chest. I slammed the steel cover back over the port so hard that the whole inner door rang like a struck bell, the sound rolling around that concrete airlock and coming back at us off every surface. And I had Dale by the arm, and we were both stumbling back against the equipment rack. The yellow suits swaying on their pegs, and the looping voice on the landing kept going through the half-shut outer door, calm and dead and decades old. Containment is stable. Do not open the inner door. And for the first time since I'd heard it, it did not sound like an instruction. It sounded like a plea. It sounded like the voice of a man who had stood where I was standing and looked through that port and understood, and had recorded these words for whoever came next, because he could not find any others. We did not run. I need to explain why, because running would have been the only sane thing. And we didn't do it. And the reason we didn't matters for everything that came after. We didn't run because of the meter. The RTG output meter on the landing wall, the needle that I'd glanced at and read as sitting in the green. As Dale and I stood there in the airlock with our backs against the rack and our breath coming hard, my grandfather's last words came back to me. RTG output dropping below half. Cooling plant cycling longer each month. It will not outlast me by long. His lifetime was over. He was 8 months dead. I pushed myself off the rack and went back out through the half-shut wheel door to the landing, and I opened the steel cover over the meter again, and I looked at the needle. Really looked this time, the way I'd look at a gauge on a job, when a man's life depended on the reading. What I'd glanced at as the middle of the green was the very bottom edge of it. The needle was sitting at the low boundary, almost touching the yellow band that began the warning range. The nuclear battery that had run the code for 70 years was finally, genuinely, measurably dying. The isotope had decayed and decayed across the decades exactly as physics said it must. And now it no longer made enough heat to make enough power. And the cold it had held for a human lifetime was beginning at last to lose. I am a backup power man. I have spent 30 years walking into rooms where something critical is about to lose its power. And the first thing you learn in that trade, the lesson they don't put in the manuals, is that the moment a system begins to fail is the exact moment that every person involved begins to make their worst decisions. Panic narrows you. The only thing that helps, the only thing, is to slow your breathing down and read the actual numbers and act on the numbers instead of the fear. So I made myself read the numbers. Beside the cooling plant access panel, behind another hinged cover, I found a second gauge, the compressor runtime indicator, a simple drum counter and a duty cycle dial. And it confirmed what my ear had already told me at the trapdoor. The compressor was running almost continuously now, barely resting between cycles, fighting to hold a temperature against a power supply that could no longer fully feed it. The cold inside that chamber was being maintained by a 70-year-old machine working at the absolute ragged limit of a battery that was running out. When that machine lost its fight, then as the chamber would warm. And the thing on the gurney, the thing with the tracking eyes and the breathing chest, was waiting, with an open-eyed patience that had outlasted everything, for exactly that. "We have to go," Dale was saying behind me. He'd followed me out to the landing, and he was saying it over and over, low and fast. "Russ, we have to go. We have to get out and call somebody. We have to call somebody right now." "And tell them what?" I said. I was already crouched at the cooling plant panel, my hands moving, because moving my hands was the only thing keeping the fear at the edge of the room instead of in the center of my chest. I was doing the thing I always do, the thing that has saved my life twice on job sites and was about to nearly end it here. I was solving the problem instead of fleeing it. We climb out, we drive to where there's signal. We call the county. A deputy comes out, eventually. He doesn't believe a word of it. Why would he? And then he comes down here to see for himself. Because that's what people do, Dale. People open doors. He spins that wheel and he opens the inner door to take a look at the crazy thing the Crane brothers were raving about. And then it's not in a box anymore. I looked up at him. Or we call the state. And it takes them 3 weeks to find the right office. Because the office that built this place stopped existing before we were born. And by the time anyone with authority gets here, the battery's dead, and the cold's gone, and it's already out. "So what do we do?" Dale said. His face in the red light was gray. "Russ, so what the hell do we do?" And here is the trap I walked into. I walked into it with my eyes wide open, the same as the eyes behind that glass. I looked at the dying nuclear battery and the straining 70-year-old compressor, and I thought, with the awful confidence that is the worst thing in me, I can fix this. Not the thing on the gurney. I couldn't fix that, and I knew it in my gut as a fact beyond argument. But the cold, was a machine problem. And machine problems are mine. They have always been mine. If I could put another power source onto that cooling plant, I could buy time. I could keep the cold running long enough to get the right people out here. People who understood what my grandfather had given his whole quiet life to guarding. People with the authority and the means to deal with it properly. I could do the responsible thing. I could be the competent man who held the line where 4 generations had held it before me. I could hand the problem on, intact and cold, the way it had been handed to me. That was the worldview that had carried me down the ladder, and it was about to cost me more than I have ever paid for anything in my life. We had a generator, a good one, a portable diesel unit, a real workhorse, sitting in the bed of my pickup up in the August daylight, that I'd brought from home for running power tools during the cleanout. We had fuel, 2 full jerry cans of diesel in the truck bed and most of a tank in the truck itself. The cooling plant ran on standard line voltage. I'd already seen behind the access panel the heart of why this was even possible. There was an old manual transfer switch, a heavy knife blade affair, wired so that the cooling plant could be fed either from the RTG or from an external source. Someone my grandfather, or one of the men before him, or the engineers who first built the place, had wired in the capacity to bridge external power to the cold if the nuclear battery ever faltered. The whole station had been designed by people who knew, with certainty, that the battery would one day die, and who had built in a way to bridge the gap. They had thought of everything. Everything except the one thing they couldn't build. A person willing enough or foolish enough to come down here and connect the bridge. I told Dale to go up top and bring the generator and the fuel down to the landing, piece by piece. He didn't want to leave me alone on that landing, 6 feet of steel from the thing behind the door. I didn't want to be alone on that landing either. But the generator was heavy and the shaft was narrow, and one of us had to start prepping the transfer switch. And so we split up. And that splitting up is the decision I would take back, if I could take back only one thing out of all of it. While he was up top, I worked on the panel. I had my headlamp throwing a white cone over the old wiring and my tool roll open on the cold concrete, and the small, real comfort of doing something with my hands, of being inside a problem I understood. The transfer switch was older than I was, but it was well made, military grade, and someone had kept the contacts clean and the mechanism oiled. The same careful hand that had oiled the trapdoor lock and repainted the warnings. The feed terminals were labeled in faded engraver's script, RTG, external load. I stripped the leads I'd need with my knife, twisting the copper bright. And I laid out where the cable would land when Dale lowered it down. And the entire time I worked, 6 feet away through the steel inner door, the looping voice repeated its plea. And beneath it, beneath the voice, I began to hear something else. Something new. A slow, soft tapping from inside the inner chamber against the steel of the door. Not frantic. Not the wild pounding of a thing trying to break out, which I think I could almost have borne. Because panic is at least familiar, at least human. This was patient, evenly spaced. The unhurried tap of a single fingernail or knuckle against metal, the way a man might idly drum his fingers on a tabletop while he waits for something he is certain is coming. Tap, tap, tap. Then a pause. Long enough that I would convince myself it had stopped, long enough for my shoulders to begin to come down, and then tap, as though it knew I was there, as though it had heard the second voice up the ladder and the scrape of my tools on the concrete and the strip of my knife on copper wire, and understood, in whatever frozen architecture still passed for a mind behind those eyes, that after 70 unbroken years, something on the other side of its door was finally changing. I worked faster, My hands had begun to shake, and I made myself slow them, breathing through it. Because shaking hands stripped the wrong wire and crossed the wrong terminal. And a mistake on a live panel kills you, whether or not there's a monster behind the door. Dale lowered the generator down on a rope through the shaft. In 2 trips, the engine block first, swinging and scraping against the concrete, then the fuel cans roped together. We wrestled the unit onto the landing between us, both of us grunting with the weight in that cramped space. And the noise of dragging its steel feet across the concrete floor set the tapping going faster, quicker now, almost eager. And Dale heard it. And he froze with a jerry can in each hand, his knuckles white on the handles. "It knows we're here," he said. His voice had gone flat with fear. "Russ, it knows we're down here. It's cold and it's old, and it's behind 2 steel doors and a wheel seal that's held for 70 years, I said, which was true, and which I needed badly to be enough. "We run the generator. We keep the cold on. We call it in. That's the whole job, Dale. That's all we're doing. We don't open anything. We don't go near it. We just keep it asleep. I got the generator running." The first real problem with running a portable diesel in a confined underground space is the exhaust. Carbon monoxide is invisible and odorless, and it will lay you down quietly and never let you up. And the last thing I wanted was to suffocate the 2 of us and leave the whole bunker open and unattended for whoever wandered in next. So that was the next problem I solved. And solving it kept the fear at the edge of the room a while longer. I'd brought a length of flexible dryer ducting in my supplies, and I rigged it onto the generator's exhaust and ran it out of the airlock and up the base of the ladder shaft. Crude. But it worked, and it worked for a clean reason. The cold air sinking down the shaft and the hot exhaust wanting to rise set up a natural draft. The shaft pulling air like a chimney, the cold pouring down one side and the fouled warm air drawn up and out the open trapdoor above. I watched the haze of it clear and felt the air on the landing stay breathable, and I let out a breath. The generator note settled into a steady, throaty drone that filled the whole shaft and drowned the looping voice and, for a moment, the tapping too. And I threw the manual transfer switch over from RTG to external, the heavy knife blade dropping home with a solid mechanical clunk. The cooling plant surged. I heard it the instant it happened, the compressor catching a full charge of clean power for the first time in years. The motor note climbing and digging in hard, biting down on the load the way a tired machine does when you finally feed it what it's been starving for. The cold coming off the inner door deepened, sharpened. The frost on the steel cover of the observation port thickened visibly, blooming whiter. And the tapping behind the door slowed, and stopped. I had done it. I'd bridged the power. I'd bought the time. I stood there on that landing, in the diesel drone and the deepening cold. And I felt the specific, dangerous, treacherous satisfaction of a man who has just fixed the unfixable, and Dale gripped my shoulder hard. And for about 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes, I genuinely believed we were going to walk up that ladder and drive to where the phone worked and make a call and have all of this become someone else's nightmare by sundown. Then I looked at the fuel, and I started doing the math, and the math is where the whole thing turned. 2 jerry cans, 5 gallons each, 10 gallons, plus most of the truck's tank. Call it another 15 if I siphoned it. 25 gallons maybe, all in. The generator under this cooling load would burn something like half a gallon an hour, maybe a touch more with the compressor pulling hard and continuous. Call it 50 hours of runtime if everything went perfectly and I babied the throttle. 50 hours. 2 days, a little more, to get the right people to a quarantine bunker that existed on no record I was ever going to find, under a farmhouse outside a town that most people in this country couldn't locate on a map. 50 hours. And after that, the fuel was gone, and the cold would fail anyway. And we would be exactly where my grandfather had spent his whole quiet life, preventing us from being, except that now the trapdoor was open, the secret was loose, and there was nothing between that gurney and the open August sky but a diesel engine running on borrowed time, and two exhausted, frightened men. That was when the math turned on me. I am good at math. It is the cruelest thing about being good at math, the way it will not let you comfort yourself with a hope once the numbers have killed it. I stood on that landing in the drone of the generator, and I worked the arithmetic of our situation through twice. And both times, it came out the same. And what it said was this: I had not solved the problem. I had only moved the deadline 50 hours into the future and chained us to the spot in the meantime. Because someone had to stay and run the generator. You do not leave a portable diesel running unattended for 50 hours on a hose-rigged exhaust in a concrete hole. It needs refueling every few hours. It needs watching the oil, the exhaust, the load. If it runs dry, it stops, and the cold dies. If the exhaust backs up, it poisons the shaft. Someone had to feed it and watch it the whole time. Someone had to stay down here, in the cold, with the tapping and the open eyes and the looping plea, for 2 days. Which meant that the responsible thing I had just done so competently, the bridge I'd been so proud of throwing, had quietly turned both of us into hostages to it. One of us goes for help and the right equipment, I said slowly, working it out aloud. One of us stays here and runs the generator. We trade off when whoever leaves gets back. Dale didn't like the trade. I didn't like it either. The phone situation at the farm was its own small misery, a single weak bar that came and went with the wind, which was why we'd been driving into Holloway every evening to call our wives and tell them we were still alive and still digging. The nearest reliable signal was the gas station out at the county road junction, 11 minutes away by truck on gravel and then 2-lane blacktop. The nearest sheriff's substation was a good 40 minutes past that. And we both understood, without either of us saying it, the real shape of the trade. The man who left would be driving off to make a phone call that no sane dispatcher would believe a story about a Cold War quarantine bunker and a breathing corpse under a cornfield. And the man who stayed would be alone, in the red light and the cold, with the very thing he was describing, listening to it wait. I told Dale to go. I told him to go because I understood the cooling plant, and he didn't. And because if anything down here started to fail, I was the only one of the two of us who might be able to nurse it along. That was the practical reason, and it was true. There was another reason underneath it that I didn't say, which was that I was the older brother, and the older brother stays with the dangerous thing. I told him to take the truck and drive to the junction and call the sheriff first, and then call the state public health office, and then call anyone official whose number he could find, and to keep calling, station to station, agency to agency, until somebody with real authority got into a vehicle and pointed it at us. I told him to bring back all the diesel the station would sell him, every can he could fit in the bed. And I told him to leave the trapdoor open for the exhaust draft, but to drag the rented dumpster halfway across the pantry doorway so that if anyone, not a neighbor, a meter reader, a curious kid wandered into the empty house while we were down here, they couldn't easily find the hole in the floor or the thing it led to. He didn't want to leave me. He stood at the bottom of the ladder with his hand on the rung. And he looked at me for a long moment in the red light and the diesel haze. I made him go. The last thing I said to him was practical and stupid, and I have replayed it 1,000 times in the dark since. I told him to drive careful on the gravel, because the truck pulled to the right and the back end got loose on loose stone. As if the gravel were the danger. As if the danger were anywhere in this world but 6 feet behind me, through a steel door, waiting in the cold. He climbed the ladder. I heard his boots ring on the 22 rungs, and then the scrape and grunt of him dragging the dumpster across the pantry floor far above. I heard the truck door slam, distant and small through the open trapdoor, and the engine turn over, and the crunch of the tires on the gravel of the drive. And then the engine sound thinned and stretched out down the county road, fainter and fainter, until it was gone entirely into the August afternoon. And then it was just me. Me, and the steady drone of the generator, and the looping dead voice, and the deep machine cold, and the silence behind the inner door where the tapping had stopped. I sat down on the landing, with my back against the cold concrete, and my headlamp throwing its cone across the cooling plant gauge and the dwindling fuel. And I settled in to wait. And it was in that waiting, in the stillness with nothing to do but watch the needle and the fuel level and listen, that I finally began to understand the second layer of what my grandfather had given his life to guarding. Because in the quiet, with the generator's drone become a wall of steady sound my ears had learned to hear past, I finally heard the looping voice all the way through. I had thought it was a single sentence. Containment is stable. Do not open the inner door every 11 seconds, forever. But sitting still in the cold with nothing to distract me, I realized there was more to it. The 11-second loop was only the front of a longer recording. Every so often, maybe once in every 20 cycles, with no pattern I could find, the speaker would carry on past the loop point, on into a fuller message, more words in that same calm, dead professional voice, before snapping abruptly back to the start. I think the recording medium had degraded across the decades, the loop collapsing inward on itself, eating its own tail, until only fragments of the original full message survived to surface at random intervals, like pieces of a torn letter blown out of a drawer. So I had to wait and listen and hold each fragment in my memory and assemble the whole thing piece by piece out of the parts that floated up. It took me the better part of an hour, sitting there in the cold, refueling the generator once, catching fragments and fitting them together. This is what the original message said, the full thing, in the patient, unhurried voice of a man who had been dust for half a century before I ever set my hand on that wheel. This is Field Isolation Station 7. Containment is stable. Do not open the inner door. The subject is not deceased. The subject is in a state of metabolic arrest, induced and maintained by sustained low temperature. Warming will reverse the arrest. The pathogen does not spread by air. It does not spread by contact with surfaces. It spreads by the subject. Do not allow the subject to make contact with a living host. If containment fails, the recommended action is termination of the subject by incineration prior to revival. This station was not authorized to perform termination. This station was ordered to maintain cold storage indefinitely, pending a command decision that was never delivered. To whoever inherits this station and these instructions, the decision is now yours. We are sorry. God help you. End message. I sat with that for a long time, in the cold, with my knees drawn up and the generator droning and the needle in the green. The pieces of it rearranged everything I thought I understood. And they did it the way a single new fact can rearrange the meaning of an entire failure once you finally see it. The thing on the gurney was not a corpse, and it was not a sample. It was a person, or it had been, a human being, infected with something that the government of this country had been at once too afraid to destroy and too afraid to study. And so, they had simply frozen the problem solid and walked away from it and left it ticking under the corn for somebody else to inherit. And every man who had inherited the station, since every name in that logbook, all the way down to my grandfather, all the way down, now, to me, had made the same choice in the end. Keep the cold running. Pass the decision down the line. Because the recommended action, the only safe action, was to burn a living man alive in his cold cell before he woke up. And not one of them, not one single man across 70 years, had been able to do it. The pathogen does not spread by air or contact. It spreads by the subject. I turned that sentence over and over in the cold until I understood it fully. And when I understood it, the chill I felt had nothing to do with the air around me. It meant the thing on the gurney was not a reservoir of disease to be quarantined, a jar of plague to be kept sealed. It was a vector that propagated itself. It spread by making more of itself, by getting its hands, or its mouth, or whatever it used now, onto someone alive. One subject, frozen for 70 years, because the moment it touched a single living person, there would be 2 of them, and then 4. And then the spreading arithmetic that has no top to it. The men who built this place had understood exactly what they were holding, with perfect clarity, and they could not bring themselves to end it. And so they made it cold, and made it quiet, and made it somebody else's burden, generation after generation, handing the frozen decision down the years until it landed in the lap of a backup power technician sitting on a concrete landing, keeping the thing asleep with a borrowed diesel generator and 25 gallons of fuel. I'm going to ask you something now, and I mean it honestly, because I have never once settled it in my own mind. The recording told me, in plain words, that the only truly safe answer was to let the cold fail and burn the chamber and the thing in it before it woke. My grandfather, who'd spent decades down here with a paintbrush, couldn't do it. 4 generations of men with badges and orders and training, couldn't do it. If you had been the one sitting on that landing with the fuel slowly running down and a living thing behind the door, that the cold was the only thing holding back, could you have done what none of them could? I keep telling myself I'd like to think I could have, in the calm of a decision freely made. I didn't get the chance to find out the clean way. The thing behind the door took that chance away from me, and it took it in a manner so deliberate that I'm still not certain, to this day, how much of what happened next was my decision, and how much of it was its. It happened around the 4-hour mark. The generator had settled into its drone, and I'd refueled it once more from the first jerry can, and I was watching the level in the second, rationing it in my head against the runtime math. I had been awake for nearly 2 days by then, and the cold and the monotony and the dark were dragging at me, the way they do, the way I'd warned 100 junior techs they would on a long overnight job. I caught myself nodding, my chin dropping toward my chest, and I snapped awake with my heart slamming against my ribs. Because in the half-second I'd been gone, the soundscape of the bunker had changed. The compressor note had dropped. I was up and at the gauge before I was fully awake, my headlamp swinging. The cooling plant cycle had stretched out long. The needle on the chamber thermometer, an old dial gauge wired to a sensor inside the inner room, had come up. 2 degrees. 2 degrees does not sound like anything. 2 degrees in a system that had held rock steady for 70 years was a catastrophe written small. I checked the generator first, because that's the discipline. Check your power source before you blame your load. The generator was running fine. Full output, fuel in the tank, the transfer switch solid in the external position, the knife blade seated true. The problem was not the power. The problem was the cooling plant itself. I tore the access panel the rest of the way off and got my hands and my headlamp into the guts of that compressor in the red light. And I found the failure. And it was the kind of failure I should have seen coming and didn't, because I'd been so fixed on the dying battery that I'd missed the obvious truth standing right beside it. A 70-year-old refrigeration compressor, a machine that for decades had run gentle, brief cycles on the trickle of power a fading nuclear battery could provide, never working hard, never straining. I had just fed it all the power it could eat for the first time in 50 years, and asked it to run flat out and continuous. And it had begun to fail under exactly that strain. A refrigerant line weeping at a fitting gone brittle with age. A compressor with its bearings finally giving up, the motor laboring, the cooling capacity falling away. Nothing I could fix with the tools in my roll. Nothing anyone could fix without parts that hadn't been manufactured since the Eisenhower administration was new. I had done the competent thing, the responsible thing, the thing I was proudest of in all of it. And the competent thing had broken the only system on this earth that mattered. The temperature climbed, slowly at first a degree every 20 minutes or so, off the dial gauge and then faster, accelerating the way these things do. As the compressor's failing capacity fell further and further behind the heat leaking into the chamber, I got into the cooling plant with everything I had, trying to nurse it, trying to coax the failing compressor and seal the weeping line. My hands raw with cold and slick with old refrigerant oil. My headlamp fogging with my own breath. I had, by my best read of the rate, maybe an hour, maybe a little less. An hour before the chamber crossed whatever invisible threshold separated metabolic arrest from metabolism, before frozen waiting became warm motion. And Dale was at least an hour out, even if every single thing had gone perfectly for him. Which, with the phone signal the way it was at the junction, I already knew in my gut it hadn't. The tapping started again behind the door, but it was not tapping for long. It built. From the patient, single taps, into something faster, more insistent. And then it was not tapping at all. It became pressure. The slow, deliberate push of a weight against the steel, testing it, leaning into it, feeling for the give. And then, and this is the sound I will hear in the dark for the rest of my life, I heard the inner wheel handle on the far side of the door. The handle I could not see. The handle that should not have been able to move at all, begin to turn. The faint grind of a wheel seal that had not moved in 70 years, turning from the inside. I want to tell this next part exactly right, because it's the part that decides whether the man telling you all this is someone you should listen to or someone you should only pity. I had 3 choices and about 40 minutes to make one of them. I could climb the ladder and run, leave the bunker open and the cold failing and the thing waking, and drive to meet Dale and pray that help came before it climbed out of that shaft into an empty farmhouse, and then a county, and then a country. That was the choice that let me live for certain, and it was the choice that risked everything else. I could stay and try to physically hold the inner door, which was insane, and I knew it was insane even as the thought formed. Because no man alive holds a steel door against a thing strong enough to turn a 70-year-old wheel seal from the inside. Or I could do the thing the recording had recommended, the thing 4 generations of better men had refused to do, the thing my grandfather had come down a ladder at 93 years old to beg me, between the lines, to find the spine for. The recording said incineration, termination by incineration prior to revival. I did not have a way to incinerate a sealed concrete chamber. But I am a backup power man, and I had a diesel generator and the better part of 2 jerry cans of fuel and a confined concrete space and a single shaft to vent it. And I had 30 years of hard-won knowledge of exactly how a fuel-air mixture behaves in an enclosed space. because that knowledge is the difference between a tech who comes home at night and one they pull out of a transformer vault. I knew, standing there in the red light with the wheel handle grinding, that I could turn that bunker into the thing the government had been too cowardly to build. I knew I could end it. And I knew, with the same cold certainty, that if I did it and got the timing even slightly wrong, the shaft was the only way out, and I would not be using it. I think the men before me couldn't do it because to them the subject had a face. A frozen human face behind a circle of glass, eyes open. And you cannot murder a face. I had seen the face too, and felt that same thing, the deep animal refusal. But I had also heard the full recording, all the way through, the part the loop had nearly eaten. And so I understood what those men maybe never let themselves understand all the way down. The thing behind that door was not a man who would be saved if I only let him warm. It was a man who would end, finally and completely, the very instant it woke, replaced entirely by the thing that had been wearing him for 70 frozen years, the thing waiting with open eyes for a door to open. Letting it live wasn't mercy. There was no man left in there to be merciful to. Letting it live was only passing the dying down one more generation, the way it had been passed to me, except that this time there would be no cold left to pass it into, and no quiet farmer to keep the cold, and no decades to hand it down. This time the line ended, one way or the other, with me. The wheel handle turned another quarter rotation. The gasket seal gave a long, wet hiss as it broke its decades-old grip. I made the call. I would love to tell you I made it bravely, with a clear heart. I made it the way you make every real decision under collapse, which is fast and sick and certain all at the same time, your body moving before your conscience can convene a vote. I dragged both jerry cans into the airlock, right up against the inner door, against the door that was even now beginning to turn from the inside. I unscrewed the caps, and the smell of diesel filled the cold air. I jammed the outer airlock door's wheel so that it could not fully seal. I needed the shaft to vent enough that the blast wouldn't simply detonate the whole structure with me standing in it. But I needed the airlock itself to remain a chamber, to channel and contain the fire and throw it at the inner door when that door finally gave. I pulled the exhaust hose off the generator's proper vent and fed its hot, fuel-rich output into the airlock instead, building the mixture in that small space, fouling the cold air with vapor and heat. And then I backed up the ladder shaft, paying out the generator's own fuel line behind me, soaked through with diesel, all the way down to the bottom of the ladder, a long dark fuse trailing into the airlock's open mouth. Then I did the only thing that gave me any chance of living through what I was about to do, which was to climb. I went up those 22 rungs faster than I have ever moved in my 51 years, hand over hand, my boots barely touching the steel. And behind me and below me, the wheel handle was grinding around, and the gasket was hissing open, and the cold was dying out of the chamber. And I got my head and shoulders, and then my torso up through the trapdoor into the gray daylight of the pantry, and I rolled half onto the floorboards, and I struck the lighter I had carried in my pocket for 15 years, since I was a younger man and a smoker, and I dropped it onto the diesel-soaked line at the very lip of the shaft. The fire went down the shaft the way water finds a drain, a bright snake of it, racing down the line into the dark and the cold and the waiting fuel air below. I hauled the rest of my body up and out and rolled away from the open trap door across the pantry floor, and the bunker breathed out underneath me. It was not an explosion, not the way the pictures show you, all orange and rolling. It was a deep, flat, concussive whump that I felt in my chest and in my teeth and in the floorboards under my body. The sound of a confined volume igniting all at once, and a column of flame and black smoke punched straight up out of the open trapdoor and scorched a black star across the pantry ceiling. And the heat of it slammed across the room and threw me bodily through the pantry doorway into the kitchen. My eyebrows gone, my face seared, my ears ringing with a high, steady tone that drowned out the world. I lay on the kitchen floor. The roar came up out of the ground beneath the house. The sound of a sealed concrete room full of fuel air and 70 years of patient waiting all going at once. A sustained, tearing roar that I felt more than heard through the ringing. And over the roar, just for a moment, just for one single moment, I heard something come up out of that chamber that was not a machine and was not a man. I will not try to describe it. I have tried alone, in the dark, on the nights I can't sleep, and there are no words I'm willing to put to it, because to use the words would be to make it real again in the room with me. It came once, threaded up through the roar of the fire, and then the fire took it, and then there was only the fire. I crawled out of that farmhouse on my hands and knees, through the kitchen and out the back door, and I got down into the dead August grass of the yard. And I lay there on my back and watched black smoke pour up out of my grandfather's pantry window into the white sky. And lying there, with my eyebrows singed off and my hands blistering and my ears ringing, I understood that I had just done the thing the United States government had built a nuclear-powered concrete bunker for the express purpose of avoiding, and that no one alive would ever believe a word of it, and that the only proof of any of it had just been incinerated by my own hand. Dale came back 40 minutes later with 2 sheriff's deputies following his truck in their cruiser, and a state public health phone number written on his palm that had rung and never once been answered. The fire had mostly burned itself out by then. A concrete shaft full of fuel air burns ferociously hot and ferociously fast, and then it is simply done. The fuel consumed, nothing left to feed it. And the farmhouse, old and dry, as kindling as it was, somehow did not catch and burn to the ground. The trapdoor and the shaft had channeled the force of the blast down and out rather than up and across, exactly as I had half calculated and half prayed it would. And the scorching to the pantry ceiling was the worst of it above ground. The deputies found a black-starred hole in a pantry floor, a melted, slumped ruin of a generator at the bottom of a fire-blackened concrete shaft, and a story from 2 exhausted, soot-streaked, blistered brothers about a Cold War government quarantine station and a frozen man who breathed. They ran the property records, standing in the yard talking into their radios while I sat on the back step with a wet rag pressed to my face. There was nothing. No Field Isolation Station 7, no public health survey, no federal land transfer, no decommissioning record. The nuclear battery appeared on no inventory any agency could produce. The land was zoned agricultural and had been continuously since 1911. As far as the state of which my grandfather's trapdoor had once been the property was concerned, Walter Crane had owned a corn farm with a root cellar. And 2 grieving middle-aged men clearing out their dead grandfather's house had done something careless and tragic with a portable generator and a quantity of diesel fuel during the work. And they were lucky, the deputies told us, lucky beyond any sense, that neither of them had been killed. I let them believe it. There was nothing else on this earth to be done. The proof was ash. Dale and I have never told the full story to another living soul, not our wives, not anyone, until tonight, until you. We did one thing for ourselves. We drove 3 counties over, days later, to an emergency room where no one knew us. And we made up an exposure story to get full blood work drawn, because the recording had said the pathogen spread by the subject, and I had been 6 feet from it, behind a door, for hours. And I had to know whether the thing had reached me somehow, through the steel, through the cold, in some way I didn't understand. The blood work came back clean. Both of us. Whatever it was, it never reached us. The cold had held it just long enough, and the fire had finished it before it could finish breaking through. And we were never hosts. That is the single piece of grace in the whole black thing, and I hold on to it with both hands. But here is what I cannot put down. Here is the reason I'm telling this at all. After a year of silence, when the deputies were poking around the bottom of the burned shaft with their flashlights, before the structural engineer came out and condemned the whole back of the house, one of them found the RTG meter. Charred, its glass face crazed and smoked, but intact, its little hinged cover hanging open on its hinge, and the needle I'd watched sit at the bottom edge of the green and red as a battery dying, the dying battery that was the whole reason I had gone down to bridge the power in the first place. That needle was sitting firmly, squarely, back in the middle of the green, recovered, steady, strong. I have thought about that needle more than I have thought about anything else in my life. More than the eyes, more than the breath, more than the sound in the fire. A radioisotope thermoelectric generator does not recover. It cannot. It decays on a fixed half-life, predictable to the day, to the hour. Its output goes one direction only, down, slowly, smoothly, across the decades, and never, ever back up. The dying output I had read off that gauge could not have climbed back on its own, which means it was never dying, which means the cooling plant was not failing for lack of power. The cooling plant began to fail at the exact moment I gave it more power than it had ever had in 70 years. The chamber temperature began to climb right after I bridged the generator in. The patient tapping became deliberate pressure, and the wheel handle began to turn from the inside, only after I had come down into that bunker and started fixing things, started feeding the old machine, started changing the one thing that had been constant for a lifetime. I think the thing behind that door was smarter than 70 years of frozen waiting had any right to leave it. I think it understood, when it heard tools and 2 voices and the surge of a second power source arriving after a lifetime of one silent old man and his trickle of nuclear current, that the way out was not to break the door. The way out was to make the man on the other side of it believe his code was failing to manipulate the only thing in its world that it could reach, which was the false reading of a dying battery and a labored compressor. To make me push the 70-year-old machine past its breaking point with my own hands, to make me do the breaking for it. I think it very nearly worked. I think the only reason I am here and you are hearing my voice, instead of something else's, is that I read the numbers wrong in the one single direction that happened to save me, that I assumed the worst and burned it all down a full hour before I strictly had to, instead of doing what a more careful, more patient, more competent man would have done, which was to keep nursing a dying system that was not actually dying, right up until the moment the thing had chosen. My grandfather's note said, "If the cold ever stops, do not open it. If the cold is still running, you may have time to close it again." I understand it now in a way I could not in that kitchen with the lantern light. He was not telling me whether it was safe to open the trapdoor. He was telling me that the only signal in this whole business I could ever trust was the cold itself, the cold, not the meter, not the gauge, not the compressor's note. And that the very moment I started to believe the cold was failing, I should trust that belief the very least, examine it the hardest, because the cold failing was the one single thing in all the world that the thing behind the door most wanted me to believe. The farm sold last spring. We disclosed the fire and the condemned pantry and the structural repairs, because all of that was on record now and could be inspected. And we disclosed nothing else, because there was nothing else on any record anywhere to disclose. The family that bought it has 2 kids and a brown dog and a plan to grow heirloom tomatoes where the corn used to wave. I drive past on the county road sometimes, not often, less than I used to. And I see the laundry on the line in the yard and the dog asleep in the sun on the porch. And I tell myself, it is over. It is burned. The blood work was clean, the fire was thorough. It is done, and a family is happy on top of the place where it used to be. But I think about that meter. Recovered, steady, green, after 70 years and a fire. And I think about the men who built that station, and the choice they made to put a nuclear battery under it, a power source rated to run not for a few years, but for a century or more. Far, far longer than any biological sample needs to stay cold. Far longer than any reasonable command decision could possibly take. I no longer believe they built it to last that long, because they couldn't decide. I think they built it to last that long, because they already understood what I only learned on that landing. In the cold, with the tapping in my ears, that the thing inside was patient past any human measure of patience, and that patience like that does not need to be waited out. It needs to be outlasted. And the only safe length of time to keep something like that asleep, the only honest number, is forever. I ended it in a single August afternoon with a portable diesel generator and a 15-year-old lighter. And the blood work came back clean. And by every reckoning, I should be able to call that a victory and sleep the sleep of a man who held the line where 4 generations could not. I would be able to. Except for one thing I have never told Dale, and never told the deputies, and never told my wife. And am only telling now to you in the daylight. Because saying it out loud in the daylight is the only thing I have found that makes it any smaller at all. When I dropped the lighter, and the fire raced down the shaft, and the bunker breathed out that whump, and that long, tearing roar, and that one sound I will not describe. In the half-second before the roar swallowed everything, under the sound the thing made, I heard the looping recording play one last time. The calm, dead, professional voice, playing its fragment up out of the cold and into the fire as the speaker melted off the landing wall. And it did not say containment is stable. It did not say, do not open the inner door. What it said, in that last half-second before the heat took the speaker and the words and the whole buried secret of my family with it, was the longer message, the fuller one, the part the degraded loop had eaten and only ever played at random. It said, if containment fails, the recommended action is termination by incineration prior to revival. Prior to revival. I have done the math on those 2 words too. I do it every night. I lie in my own bed in my own house, and I do the arithmetic of that last hour over and over. And it will not come out clean. The chamber temperature had been climbing for over an hour by then. The patient tapping had become a steady, leaning pressure on the steel. The wheel handle had turned more than once. The seal had hissed open. And I lit that fire, and I keep asking myself the one question I will never be able to answer. Did I light it prior to revival, the way the recording said I must, while the thing was still in arrest, still frozen, still asleep, still safe to burn? Or was I already too late? Was the cold already gone from that chamber? Had the thing on the gurney, after 70 years of waiting behind a frozen door, for someone to finally come and open it, already woken And was the sound I heard threaded up through the roar of my fire not the sound of a thing being destroyed before it could revive at all? Was it the sound of a thing that had already revived and knew it, and made that sound not because it was dying, but because after 70 years of patient waiting in the cold and the red and the dark, after manipulating one old farmer's blood into coming down a ladder with a generator and a lighter, after getting so close to the one thing it had wanted for the length of a human lifetime, after all of that, someone had finally almost opened the door. I don't drive past the farm much anymore. The tomatoes are doing well, I'm told, by people in town who know I once owned the place and have no idea why I go quiet when they mention it. The family is happy. The dog sleeps in the sun. The ground is quiet. And every winter, on the first hard freeze, when the cold finally comes up through the floorboards of my own house, at the end of the year, I lie awake in the dark and I listen. And I wait, the way it taught me to wait, for a sound I am terrified that one day I will recognize. So far, there has only ever been the silence. And I have learned to trust the silence the way my grandfather taught me to trust the cold, which is to say, not completely, and never, ever for long. If you made it all the way down here into the dark with me, thank you for staying this long. I genuinely don't know if I made the right call on that landing, and I've had to make a kind of peace with never knowing, because the alternative is not sleeping at all. But I'd truly like to hear it from you. Wherever you're listening from tonight, if it had been your family's farm, your grandfather's note taped under the drawer, your own hand on that lighter at the lip of the shaft, would you have burned it, or would you have run? Tell me below. And if these are the kind of stories you want to keep hearing, the slow, grounded ones that get under the floorboards and stay there, then you know where to find me. Keep your floors warm this winter. Sleep with the light on if you need to. I do most nights. I do.